All right, well, hello class and welcome to our fireside chat on innovation. As a reminder, the purpose of these discussions is to provide you with some practical context on specific topics we're covering in this course. I'm pleased to welcome two friends and colleagues who I've worked with closely over the course of my career. Both have experience with the innovation processes at CDC as well as HHS, Department of Health and Human Services. And I'm pleased to welcome them to our class in this discussion. First, I'd like to introduce Erica Riot. Erica started her career at CDC in 2009 as a presidential management fellow and public health analyst in CDC's National Center for Birth Defects and Developmental Disabilities as part of the National Center's policy team. From July 2013 to February 2014, Ms. Riot led an HHS Ignite Accelerator project focused on creating an idea lab at CDC in order to cultivate a creative culture promoting innovation. The HHS Ignite Accelerator is an internal innovation startup program for staff who want to improve the way the agency works. In 2015, Ms. Riot was promoted to the role of Chief Strategy Officer for CDC's National Center for Birth Defects and Developmental Disabilities, where she worked with the National Center's leadership to craft an overall strategic vision for the center. Erica then transitioned to CDC's Office of Appropriations, where she provided organizational units liaison support between them and congressional appropriation committees. She currently serves as a team lead for the health policy team in the Office of Policy and Partnerships at CDC's National Center for Injury Prevention and Control. Welcome to the discussion, Erica. Our second speaker today is Dr. Dan Baden. Dr. Baden is an innovative physician executive with 25 years of public health experience in both governmental and non-governmental organizations. He is board certified in family medicine and experienced with strategic planning, program development and redesign, career development, conflict resolution, collaboration building, risk management, policy development, education, and communications. Over the course of his career, Dr. Baden has developed domestic and international partnerships with the private sector, nonprofit sector, and governmental organizations. He has an extensive background in developing innovative methods to advance public health and is the recipient of 2 HHS Secretarial Initiative Innovation Awards. Dr. Baden served as the Department of Health and Human Services co-chair for the White House's National Science and Technology Council, co-chairing the working group on digital game technologies, which explored the use of games as a tool for addressing national problems. Dr. Baden currently serves as the senior advisor in the Special Initiatives branch of CDC's Division for Global HIV and TB. Thank you for joining us here today, Dan. So welcome both of you. So as I indicated previously, our discussion today will focus on innovation, in particular, the types of efforts government engages in when it comes to innovation. Government isn't always viewed by the general public as an innovative part of society, but I think there's quite a bit that goes on behind the scenes that folks don't know about. So I appreciate you joining us and having this conversation. So let's start with a question to Erica. The materials we have reviewed for this class reflect the need for organizational support for innovation in order for that to thrive. As a participant in the HHS Ignite Accelerator, what was your experience in developing and advocating for innovation within the HHS processes, as well as within CDC? And what were the positive and negative aspects of that experience from your and your team's perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Sal. I'm glad to be here. So I think, on the one hand, being part of an accelerator program like that was designed to specifically support innovation was a really nice supportive environment to get to try out something new. And so you've got a lot of heavy hitters in the agency like Adrian Foreigner, you've got what they describe as air cover for you to try things and have the support from them. And so, you got to be a bit free range in that sense. And in fact, I think at that time, at least to apply to the program, you didn't even need like supervisory approval, which is quite different than a lot of other developmental types of experiences. So there was that element to it, which was really freeing in a way, but certainly there's something about probably most all innovation that's disruptive to the status quo and probably going to ruffle some feathers if you're changing the way things have been done. And so I think, while I appreciated being in a incubation acceleration environment, it's also challenging too to be in your day-to-day job also removed from that and having support in one way, but then being within a like sub agency that does have its own bureaucracy and hierarchy, and you're kind of walking around trying to shift things. So I think that part was challenging, but I did really appreciate that being an incubator like that, we had training in like things like human-centered design, lean startup, different like concrete methods to help support the process. And across the board, I think it was a really good experience, not only for the time that I did that program, but just the things I learned and kind of the practices I learned for how to maybe make smaller shifts. And so it's, going on maybe a decade ago now, and there are ripples still that I see now from, I think, some of the work we did at that time, much later than I would have anticipated or hoped maybe like at the time, but you see them later on. And I think finally, I'll just note the other one challenge and one support. A big challenge too is about a decade ago, I think the concept of innovation for a lot of people was very wrapped up in technologies and tangibles, and innovation is the new iPhone. And nowadays, I think that perspective has broadened a lot, and people can envision innovation in processes and procedures and policies and programs and such. But I don't think it was always that way. So I'm glad to see that shift. And then a final kind of pro of thing that went well, I think in a large organization, there's always going to be nodes of people who were doing cool things or supportive. So, connecting with people like Dan at the time, or like you, Sal, I think finding people who are like-minded in some ways or trying to do something a little bit different is a really helpful way to keep you on course and, sort of make incremental changes over time too.
Well, it's great. I'm heartened to hear that you're still seeing ripples from that project 10 years later. I think that speaks well to how innovation, the impact of innovative efforts can extend beyond just the project lifecycle and can really have impacts longer term. So that's great to hear. That's new information for me. So that's awesome.
The best is when sometimes somebody will try to teach you something that like you tried to plant the seed of, you know what I mean? So it's like, they're like, well, the way we do it here is, and I'm like, yes, we tried to make that the case. And so it's not, something I expected the trajectory of how things to go. Just being like at the time, very young upstart, but I think it's maybe more impactful in the end.
Yeah, well, it's got to be pretty rewarding, see things come full circle like that. So that's great. So Dan, gaming has always been a part of our culture, even before the technological advances we've seen over the last 20 to 30 years. And I know for a fact it's been a big part of your life, both personally and professionally. Could you describe how your involvement in the working group on digital game technologies advanced innovation in the federal government, and how you've been able to translate that experience to your innovation activities at CDC?
Glad to be here as well. So I guess what Sal didn't allude to is I'm a published game designer outside of work. So that's one of my passions. I've got a huge collection of games. And so being able to do that for work is really amazing. The work group, I think it initiated in 2009 or 2010, and they brought together representatives from agencies across all the federal government. So we had people from NASA, we had people from obviously Health and Human Service, from NIH and CDC, had people from State Department. So a bunch of different people, and obviously Department of Defense. The Army does a great deal to use of simulations and or games, tabletop exercises, all those types of things kind of fall into the same category. And the idea was, can we use games to address, I think they called it grand challenges, really big problems that the government was facing. There have been some really neat things that have been developed, either as part of this initiative or on their own. But this led to a lot of cross-pollination of ideas between agencies. I spoke with people from DoD many times. They were working on patient simulators so physicians could get practice working on trauma patients if they're in the war zone, things like that. They were also working on maximizing throughput in mass vaccination clinics, which is kind of relevant nowadays. And CDC was working on a lot of similar things. We did a lot with virtual reality. We had developed a simulator to help people who were first responders deal with absolutely terrible situations, like the Indian Ocean tsunami. People who were deployed to respond to that had no idea how to deal with hundreds of thousands of casualties. So this training was put together to help people have skills to try and potentially prevent PTSD. We've got similar VR tools that are help to train laboratorians so that they can practice and mess up without using the expensive reagents, potentially damaging machinery. And we're trying to use that internationally as well. We've got VR trainings for food safety inspectors and coal miners and coal rescue personnel. So they know what to do if there's a mining disaster, how they can safely navigate their way out. But not all of it is technology, like Erica was saying. I developed a role-playing game on TB contact tracing, and I used that for a group of international people. So it's just it was a resounding success. I was really surprised how well it went over. But just the chance to share the ideas of what you're doing with others across all of government, it's inspiring to see other people take the things that you do and potentially grow them in ways that you didn't even imagine. So the cross-fertilization, cross-pollination of ideas between groups, as well as learning what other groups are doing and partnering to further your own efforts. Those are some of the great benefits that I saw from participating in this group, and it's still around.
Yeah, I think, you describing and kind of prepping folks for tsunami-like events is important, not only because it gets them trained up on what they need to do once they get out and deployed, but I think it also, takes in the human factor and does what it can to get them prepared for what they're going to deal with. And, I think those of us who sit back here at home and see these disasters and don't really engage personally forget that it can have a huge impact on the individuals who are trying to serve the public that's affected. And I think that's an important part of this innovation, is really keeping it human-centered and helping them do a better job, but also protect their mental health to a certain degree when they're engaging in stuff like that.
The idea was you'd have at least one person on the team who's gone through this training, so they have some protection themselves. They can also help support the rest of the team. And then the tertiary impact is, well, they can actually help people where they're going to serve.
Right.
So it's broad reaching impact.
Yeah, I think those real life examples are great, great ways to show how innovation can really have an across the board impact on both the public servants and the people who are affected by the public service they're trying to provide. So that's great. Erica, one area of government innovation that isn't always well known to the general public is the government's ability to access funds from outside the normal appropriation channels. In other words, funding controlled by Congress. So working through authorized foundations like the CDC Foundation, we're able to receive funding through partnerships with private, public, or quasi-public entities interested in working with agencies like CDC on similar goals and objectives. In your experience, what opportunities does third-party funding afford public agencies like CDC in terms of innovation? And what challenges to innovation are posed by such a partnership?
Yeah. So, I think in the typical federal appropriations process where we're getting the bulk of our budget from Congress, there's a lot of demand, obviously, and a lot of need. And therefore, it's pretty competitive. And I think most investments are going to go to things that are relatively sure bets. It's not a very pro risk, like we're going to gamble on something new kind of funding source typically. Now, I will say over time, I've noticed more, and you may have other examples too, but like at least in my center, we have more will build into larger kind of more classic programs, a demonstration project element or like a innovation arm to a larger activity that does support a little bit more risk taking on new things. But anyway, back to the point, by and large, partnerships with groups like CDC Foundation that let us work with other organizations that might bring resources to the table. Just inherently, I think, are a lot more flexible and more timely often because, the appropriations process is like a multi-year process, to be honest. And, relationships like that can bring not only finances to the table that can be spent a little bit more agilely than we're able to with appropriations, but oftentimes too, the partners that we work with are bringing different skill sets or different perspectives or connections to the table too. And I think that's a really strong asset as well with that type of work. So as an example, I know like CDC's emergency response last summer did a partnership with NASCAR through the CDC Foundation. And so NASCAR hosted vaccination and testing clinics for COVID at like Talladega Super Speedway, and had people come out and they could get their vaccine, and if they got it, they could ride around the track. And I actually was able to go to the event, and there were a lot of people there who said, I wasn't going to do this, but like you don't get to drive your car around Talladega that often, kind of thing. So that's not something that like typical CDC funding and resources would normally be able to support. But partnerships like that are really helpful. I think you said something about like kind of downside or risk or something that only, I think threatening element of it is it's in our role, I think it's essential and incredibly important. We are and appear to be ethical and unbiased or not, influenced inappropriately. So, for example, we definitely wouldn't want to partner with a tobacco company on tobacco control work. There are certainly lots of rigorous ethical and conflict of interest, like evaluation processes when gifts are on the table. But even so, I think, it's something to be cognizant of when we're undertaking those types of partnerships that are outside the typical appropriations process for funding. But by and large, I think it's a great kind of like laboratory for seeing on a smaller scale what might be promising, and then scaling it up into the main budget if it seems to be something that could work on a bigger scale.
Yeah, I think the conflict of interest piece is an important one because just because there might be a conflict of interest doesn't mean you can't do the project. You have to acknowledge the conflict of interest and put things into place to mitigate that, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a non-starter. For instance, in my division, we got a little over $11 million to do a communications campaign around heart disease and stroke directed at African-American adults. And two pharmaceutical companies, who I won't name, contributed, the bulk of those funds. And there's certainly conflict of interest there. Potentially, they have their own motivations, but that doesn't necessarily mean their motivations and our motivations can't come together. But you're right, it does go through a pretty extensive review process before we get the green light to take the money. But, getting $11 million when you have a $140 $40 million budget is pretty significant increase in your ability to do some pretty important work for targeted populations. So, and I know we've gotten, being in Atlanta, and I don't know if you were involved in the Zika stuff, but being in Atlanta, we got a lot of support from Home Depot and the founders of Home Depot for a variety of things, including when Zika was an outbreak and stuff like that. So there's certainly opportunities there to build those partnerships.
Oh, definitely. And I believe even our emergency operations center at CDC's sponsor was, established with support from something to do with Home Depot. So it might be named after them or something like that. But yeah.
The first one, was named.
Oh,
after
okay.
the founders, yeah.
Yeah.
What was that, Dan? Yeah. So thanks, Eric. I appreciate that insight. So Dan, we're using a textbook called The Effective Public Manager, and this discusses the importance that innovation and public entrepreneurship play in defining a successful public manager. In fact, that's one of the elements for anyone who wants to pursue a senior executive service job in the federal government is entrepreneurship. So as a CDC employee who's been involved in entrepreneurship and innovation efforts at the agency, how well is this skill set supported by your leadership? And what, if anything, do you think could be done to improve this toolkit for the 21st century public administrator?
I've been at CDC for 20 years. I've had a bunch of different supervisors, and I think we are having a nice trend towards more and more acceptance towards innovation. But like Erica said, the ability to have air cover is critical. We also had a Ignites award, and we wanted to do a game jam. That's basically where you bring student and professional game designers together with scientists to try and make demos of health-related games over a weekend. And this concept, that was a way out there concept. But when the Secretary of HHS signs off on it, it gives you incredible authority to move forward in some of these things. So if you can have that type of approach from the highest level, that's critical. The second thing that Ignite did, it was train people across government or across HHS to have some of these innovative type skills, to get some practice in it, to try and disseminate those ideas like Erica did with her work as well, across a group, and have those people throughout organizations. We then have done that at CDC as well, where we pull people with a like mindset together, like we do at the federal level, but within CDC to share ideas and to partner and different things along that line. So what could we do to improve the toolkit? I think a great thing would be just, and it's difficult, to have a higher tolerance of failure. Because in the private sector, my understanding is about 70% of ventures fail completely. About 20% have a marginal success, and about 10% are big successes. But if we try that with government programs, I don't know what the numbers of our success rate are, but if we go in with the idea we're going to fail on 70% of things, that's hard for a lot of people to swallow. So like Erica was saying, when you start to have R&D hubs or innovative hubs and things like that, proof of concept efforts where, okay, yeah, we expect a high level of failure in some of these things, but we're going to have some things that just will take off and do fabulously. If you can have that mindset partnered with the skills to do innovative approaches and to do human-centered design, to have rapid cycle improvement, all these types of things together, I think that can move us a great deal forward.
Excellent. And hopefully as a new generation of leadership kind of comes in, we'll be seeing more of a inclination towards that entrepreneurial and innovative approach to governing. It is tough though. I mean, we still have to be responsive to Congress and be accountable to them. So it's a balancing act. And that kind of leads me to my next question. And I'm gonna ask both of you to comment on this. I'll start with Erica. So public administrators are called upon to serve a dual role as both agents for stability and control, as well as change agents who are asked to develop creative solutions to challenges when the old ways no longer work. Do you consider these roles clashing or complementary? And how do you balance between the two?
Yeah. I think it's a great question. A couple of thoughts spring to mind. One is, I think something I always try to keep at the forefront is a healthy dose of criticism, or not criticism, but skepticism or whatever, that what we're currently doing is inherently better or inherently effective. Like to Dan's prior answer, I think, we don't probably know what our percentage rate of failure is right now. And it might be higher than we would guesstimate if we, actually were able to take stock of that universally. So in that, I'm just saying, I think there's this bias toward the way we're kind of doing things as the safe way. And in a lot of times, I think what we are currently doing might be letting some folks down, some certain populations in particular, or more folks across the board. But because it's like already what we're doing, it's the default, it feels comfortable to stay with the way we're operating something. So I think stability is appealing in some senses, but so anyway, keeping that in mind, that you're not just like, what are you evaluating the change against? And then, I don't feel like they're at odds as long as we're staying pretty mission centered. So if we know like why we're here, like what our purpose is, then that balance between what might work best to get to that purpose feels a little bit more natural to me. So my purpose is not to, like, I'm not here to execute this exact program. I'm here to make sure people aren't getting traumatic brain injury. And so keeping that like end purpose in mind helps me feel a little bit more capable of letting some things go, picking up new things, and really assessing like what might actually be working for people, than if I identify too much with like what we're currently doing, if that makes
Yeah, totally.
sense.
And I think, before I jump to Dan, I think one of the advantages that we have as a federal agency is that we can put money out the door to states and utilize those vehicles to kind of get them to experiment a little bit, based on the direction we have. So we get a little bit of wiggle room there where we may not necessarily be the ones experimenting directly, but we can certainly work with them to make that happen. So that might give us a little cover too. So Dan, what are your thoughts on whether these roles are clashing or complementary, and how do you balance between the two?
Yeah, so I think they're definitely complementary. And I had two thoughts as Erica was speaking. I think there's a lot of science that we at CDC know, but sometimes it's hard to translate that into usable bites of information for people in the public. And as she was talking about traumatic brain injury, I thought of CDC working with the NFL on concussion guidelines. And I mean, this is what, 10, 12, I forget how many years ago. But they were able to successfully get the NFL to adopt these new guidelines. And after that, those rule changes got incorporated into the game Madden football. And after that, people who are playing Madden football start thinking, why on earth would I put my Tom Brady or whoever into the game when I'm going to risk losing him for the rest of the season? And so it's a different way of getting some of these messages across. So the science is really good, but translating that and making it accessible is difficult. On the other side, though, we have great science that's being developed as well, and it's innovative. There was a test for HIV that was developed not too long ago that looks at the viral particles that someone has and can tell how long you've been infected. which lets you say, okay, have I been infected for 10 years or just for 6 months? And that will vary who you need to go back and do your contact tracing with. So things like, and that's now widely implemented as a policy. So you've got both science that needs a good translation, as well as brand new science that can lead to impactful outcomes. I think that was most of your question. So I think they're complementary, though.
Yeah. And I, I love the NFL example because not only did it result in changes to the NFL in the gaming industry, but it also resulted in changes to college and youth sports as well. And you see how that innovation kind of spread out across the country at all levels. And I think, that makes a huge impact when you're trying to avoid TBIs at multiple levels, because they can certainly happen as easily in a youth game as they can in an NFL game, for sure. So great examples. The last question, and again, I'll ask both Dan and Erica to respond to this, is what advice would you offer newly minted public servants who are interested in building their innovation and entrepreneurial skill sets? And I'll start with Dan.
Okay, I think I would have 2 bits of advice. The first thing is be open to anything. I'm a math major and a family physician. And somehow I ended up in charge of all of CDC's internal and external communication during emergencies. I mean, I'm a terrible speller and I'm in charge of all of this. So just be open. You never know where some of these opportunities are going to take you. And the second thing is have a long-term dream or passion, and then see if there's ways to incorporate that into the work you're doing, whatever it may be. So like I've mentioned, I'm passionate about games, and I found ways to incorporate that through many parts of my career. Find ways that what you're passionate about will actually help the program you're involved in. That's another way to get, you may not be getting air cover, but you can get support. So those would be my 2 words of advice for people who want to pursue innovation.
Yeah, I love that. And in fact, it's funny, you stirred a memory in me. When I was in my last year in grad school, I was in Atlanta visiting family, and they're asking me, what are you going to do when you graduate? And I'm like, oh, no, I hopefully work for the federal government. And they're like, oh, you should work at CDC. And I'm like, oh, please, what kind of jobs are they going to have for me at CDC? That's a science agency. And here I am 30 years later working at CDC. So you just never know. You got to be open to those opportunities for sure. Do not close down chances, because you never know where it's going to take you. Erica, how about your perspective on how newly minted public servants can build their innovation and entrepreneurial skill sets?
Yeah. I think my first thought was very similar to one that Dan mentioned of, identifying what excites you, even if it feels very tangentially related. I have found that like those things keep coming, if they keep coming up in your work, or you keep seeing you see opportunities other people don't see, maybe related to something you enjoy. So like, this is super dorky, but I love Excel, like Microsoft Excel, and like anytime, like pretty much any activity I'm doing at work, like I can we could do this better through Excel, and so my job has nothing to do with that, but I'm able to weave it in a lot. And, I think Dan with games, or I even thought of the example of Francis Collins, who was the recently retired director of the National Institutes for Health. Like he played guitar, and there were that he was able to weave into his work, and he had songs about public health things, and he would go on, late night talk shows or other forums, get spreading the message of public health in that way. So I think whatever kind of makes you light up or hit that flow state is something that you're going to see opportunities there that other people might not see. And that I think can spark some innovation. And then just my other thought, skill set wise, is, I think building in opportunities to know how to connect with people, with the end user or the humans who are benefiting from your work, and staying in tune with them and what their lives are like, and what might actually be of service to them, and what isn't working for them, like what their, what their journey is. And so you can see, be inspired by elements of that. So some like skill set wise, I think human-centered design training is great for that, or user experience, or any of those types of things give you some of those tangible, practical kind of techniques to be able to connect with people and see how you might be inspired by their experiences to build something better for them.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate both of you for your time and your valuable perspectives. I know that these insights will be very useful to my students. So thank you very much for sharing your experiences with us. And I hope you all have a great weekend.
Very
Thanks
much.
so much, Sal.